Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of the Systems of Human Performance podcast. This is an affiliate podcast to my Substack, Systems of Human Performance, which unpacks concepts of system thinking and design as it applies not just to businesses and organizations, but to the average person's daily life, goals of self improvement, and increased efficiency. My name is Michael Parent. If you want to dive deeper into these topics of system thinking and design, and specifically about the topics discussed today on individual performance, please take a look at the description below. There you will find links to all the ways you can connect with me. You can find my writing on the UX Collective, on Medium, and most importantly, on my Substack. And there are a few other ways to connect with me as well. So, first, what I want to do is just talk about the format of this podcast, since this is the debut episode. My goal is to produce one podcast like this every month as an affiliate Reader's Digest version of the preceding month's posts on Substack. And already I'm actually a bit behind schedule. Last month I was moving my family and changing houses, so I'm a little bit behind. And in August, I actually posted kind of my first campaign, my first serial of articles about the effect and impact that systems have on human performance. So, what I'd like to do today is review and summarize some of the key takeaways and excerpts from those posts. I'll also stream this live on YouTube. That's where I'm at now. So, if you're interested in watching this live, it's just going to be me as a talking head, and I'll bring up some screenshots and some of the things I talk about in the articles. But we can interact on the chat, so feel free to join me on YouTube Live. I didn't promote this one because this is kind of a nice dry run for me, but in the future, I'll start promoting these and we'll get a little bit more engagement. So with that, let's dive in. So as I mentioned, the first series of posts focused on different fundamental aspects of systems, including how they behave and in particular, how they behave relative to individuals. So I'm just going to go through them chronologically. There were four in kind of this first series of campaigns. The first one is called The Myth of Individual Excellence. And let me share my screen, and that way we can kind of walk through it. I'll share the entire screen. Cool. So we can see it. This is what the article looks like. It's got kind of this myth of Icarus and Daedalus on it. And it's all about talking about the way we typically think of human performance, performance excellence, these sorts of things. It's the common belief in the West that performance and achievement is the result of, the will, motivation, perseverance, whatever it is, it's bound up in the individual. And the purpose of this post was really to present the fundamental beliefs of a different paradigm, a paradigm that I subscribe to about performance, which, of course, is systems thinking. Systems thinking is very much opposed to how we typically think about achievement in the West, as I was mentioning, kind of that individual-based causality between performance and the human. And what systems thinking does is it really talks about how performance is actually dictated and bounded and limited, but also supported and enabled by different systems that surround the individual, different environments, different ecosystems, and of course, different technologies, right? So here's the first excerpt from this. Let me see if I can go find it on here. It says, in the West, we are raised in the paradigm of the individual. We're taught that triumph comes from talent, discipline, intelligence, and grit. We are taught that the lone visionary, the hard-driving manager, the brilliant strategist can bend the world to their will. Our mythology is built around singular heroes, the entrepreneur who revolutionizes an industry, the CEO who turns around a failing company, the athlete who breaks records through sheer determination. The West answers the question thus: winners are winners because they are winners. And this is exactly what I don't particularly like about our Western paradigm. We are very individually focused. We don't have a lot of understanding about nuance or about second order causes. And we always kind of have causality on the sharp end of the stick, right? It's always the last person to do something is the ultimate cause. Both in terms of achievement. Hey, I performed in a particular way. I was an athlete and I performed well, but also in terms of errors, right? Is, oh, I did something wrong. Well, I have to blame the person who did something wrong rather than, as we'll see in the next excerpt, look at the way systems actually dictate and influence some of our performance. So the next one is the truth about systems. So the truth is far more nuanced and ultimately far more empowering. Human beings do not operate in a vacuum. We are born into systems, parts of larger ecosystems that are nested, overlapping, invisible, and immense. These systems shape our choices, amplify or inhibit our actions, and often determine outcomes long before the individual effort is exerted. This leads to a radical truth with far reaching implications. Performance is not the property of individuals, but the result of systems. This contradicts the myth of heroic performance, dismantles the cult of meritocracy, and reveals a more humane and accurate account of how work actually gets done. This is an axiomatic truth of organizations, all organizations, and for performance, all performance. So again, it's if you kind of sit back and reflect on your own experiences, typically I think if we're self-effacing enough, we realize that it's not all about my own motivation and my own skill. That's a portion of it, that's a facet of it, but so much more is we're bound up in our own kind of the ecosystems that are around us, right? Is I give an example in the article about a nurse, right? And pick the best performing nurse in America, right? She presumed she knows what she's doing. She has extremely good bedside manner. She never makes a mistake. Chances are it's not just the nurse who's doing a good job, but she's probably also in some sort of hospital system that supports her. And probably all the nurses in that hospital system are performing at a high level. If you take that high performing nurse and you put them in the worst hospital in America, they may still perform well, but they're certainly going to regress because of the environment around them, right? If things are disorganized, if things are unclean, if there are lack of resources, if there are lack of support and untrained personnel in the hospital, that nurse can only do so much. And it's a good reflection of that axiomatic truth that systems bind and limit our performance. They also support performance, but our individual effort and our individual skill and acumen are only a small facet of the larger ecosystem. So that brings us to kind of a next point, right? Which is what do we do about kind of agency and what is our role in the system, right? So the next excerpt that I wanted to talk about is this one, right? Are we powerless cogs forever at the mercy of sprawling impersonal networks? Or can we design and redesign the systems that govern our work and lives? The answer is emphatically that we can. And this is exactly what my podcast, but my Substack is all about, is if we believe systems are important in dictating our performance, our efficiency, how we get things done, probably our happiness as well, then we need to take a deliberate approach into designing systems and make deliberate efforts to improve systems, to make them better, to identify where their weak points are, how things fail, what system behaviors are. And by recognizing those things and addressing things at the systems level, we're going to have a much larger impact, what I would call a more leveraged impact on performance, on errors, on organizations, than if we were just going in and trying to address individuals, their motivation, their acumen, their efficiency. So that's really the whole scope of the first post. It's really to kind of open our eyes to how we typically talk about human performance and why this, what I call the myth of individualism is actually the wrong way to think about it. So that was the first article in this series. The second one is called "The Systems is Boss." And the key topic of this post was really to convey leadership dilemmas, especially as it relates to things like change and improvement, and as I just mentioned, motivation and morale. So if we appreciate systems and their effects as we ought to, we cannot muster change from within. We must seek solutions from outside the system, right? But most leaders or managers, because they have this Western view of performance, the individual, which we just talked about, um, they don't appreciate systems and they rely on mustering internal resources from the system. And namely, these resources are morale and motivation. But of course, as I just mentioned, they're low leverage solutions. These sorts of things, the mustering of morale and motivation, even training, they're ultimately going to end in failure because you're not supporting individuals with a system that can bolster them. Think about the nurse we just talked about, right? Is um, you can train her, you can motivate her, you can boost her morale, but if she's in a system of that's fraught with complications and issues, she can only do so much, and you're really going to actually discourage her and demotivate her and give her lower morale by asking her to do more without supporting the system and the ecosystem around her. So um, let's read some excerpts from this one. The first one comes from the subsection called Beyond Motivation and Punishment. The traditional view of achievement focuses on human motivation, skill, and effort, how to inspire people to work harder, how to train individuals to perform at a certain level, how to reward good performance, how to address poor performance. This approach assumes that the primary constraint on performance, whether individual or organizational, is the effort or attitude or acumen of individuals. This assumption is wrong. Consider an experiment. There are two Tetris games on the computer. They are identical with one exception, the controls. In one game, the controls are intuitive. The left arrow moves the block left, the right arrow right. The up arrow rotates the block. In the second game, the mappings of the controls are scattered. The up arrow moves the block left, the down arrow right, the left arrow rotates. So the mapping is different, right? Despite perfect knowledge of these controls, despite hours of practice, despite dexterity and smarts, and even a knowledge of good Tetris strategy, the player with the more difficult configuration will never surpass the performance of even a casual player of the first configuration. Performance is dictated far more by the system than anything else. So this is the thing I've been railing about, right? Is that performance is ultimately dictated by the system and not the individual. Oftentimes we find leadership focused on the individual in terms of morale and motivation. And I'm trying to get this message across by means of kind of a thought experiment with this Tetris strategy, with this kind of mapping, right? So in one configuration, I've got Tetris just the normal way you've played it, right? You use the left arrow, it moves the block left. You use the right arrow, it moves the block right. And then in another configuration, you have the same Tetris game. However, the mapping is different, right? And it's a reflection on a worse system, right? A system that is not helping the agent, helping the individual perform as high as they could. And despite throwing resources at motivation and morale and incentives and training, because the system is worse, you're never going to outperform somebody who might not be as highly motivated or as well trained. But because the system is better, that person with the normal Tetris game is always going to perform higher. And I actually have created this experiment. So I have a consulting website. I'm not here to sell my consulting services. I'm here to talk about systems. But if you go to sixsigma-consulting.com/Tetris, I have this cool game, right? And in the first mapping, the first game, the mapping is classic, right? The left arrow moves it left, the down arrow, or excuse me, the right arrow moves it right. They're mapped as you would expect logically. So if I played this game very quickly, look at that. I'm getting two right in a row. I can very quickly put together some lines, and I'm going to get a pretty high score in the 2 minutes that I'm allowed to play this game. And you can critique my Tetris strategy if you would like. But we see here, I can move the blocks down faster by doing the hard drop as well. At this point, I'm waiting for either a green one or an orange one. I still don't have it. There's my green one there. I got 3 lines and I'm a happy camper. So I got a score of 70 in under a minute. If I go to mapping B with the controls scattered, again, this is representing a worse system, a system that is not there to support and engage the individual. Despite my motivation, despite my strategy, despite how many hours I've worked at it, I'm simply not going to perform at the same level. And here we go. So even if I have absolute perfect knowledge of these controls, and I do because I invented the game, I'm still going to struggle. And I can't even do it and talk at the same time. So it's pretty difficult. And you can see here, I'm nowhere near getting the score that I was getting beforehand. So hopefully that was an edifying experiment for you, and it's there if you care to enjoy it. So let's go ahead and jump into another excerpt from post 2 on a systems is boss. A lot of things managers desire: improvement, morale, motivation grows as a result of systems-based improvements. When individuals are supported rather than encumbered by systems meant to help them, morale takes care of itself. Enthusiasm grows naturally when people can succeed, when processes are coherent, when communication is clear, when tools function properly. When the work environment is well designed, people rise to the occasion without needing pep talks or threats. All this takes place whether or not they are enlightened to the role of systems in their lives. So a couple of things to unpack here is typically managers care a lot about engagement and morale and if their employees or people in their organization are happy. And it's kind of like a chicken and the egg thing, right? Some managers think if I make my employees motivated and highly engaged, that performance will follow. And this is actually the systems thinking has the exact opposite approach. People love to perform well. If we create a game that they can win and the things are not encumbering them, if they are helping them and supporting them, well, then naturally people are going to enjoy their jobs, and naturally morale and engagement and motivation are going to follow. And that's an important paradigm, right? It's like the one side is, hey, I think that chicken comes before the egg, and systems thinking is saying, no, the egg comes before the chicken. And you can kind of, I would say put this in proof of concept, right? If you go and have people working hard, and success is always fraught with issues, right? Think of a manufacturing plant, right? In one, there's quality issues. They're never meeting their target. Machines are breaking down all the time. And you're running around going, we got to stay motivated. We got to be engaged. We got to find ways to win. You're going to have a harder time motivating people than creating a manufacturing environment where all the machines are running well and you've solved quality problems proactively and you don't have unexpected downtime, right? And you're hitting your monthly ticket. You're hitting your monthly production numbers. Well, obviously morale and motivation is going to be a lot easier to muster in that situation. And last of all, in this example, right, is that it doesn't matter if everyone is a systems thinking expert, or even if they see systems as part of their lives. This is an effect of systems, whether or not we recognize it and appreciate it or not. So another excerpt then, let's go find it. Leadership as systems design, right? So again, if we think about leadership, how it's traditionally thought of, it's all about the individual again, motivating people, making sure people know what they're doing, giving them morale, try to get their morale going. But systems thinking is quite the exact opposite. From this perspective, anybody who wants to take on a leadership role, whether that be in their industry as a manager, in the sphere of public opinion as an activist, politician, or academic, or even in your personal life as a person who simply wants to do more and achieve more, the task becomes clear. Change, improvement, personal betterment, performance stems from a discipline of systems design and continual redesign. To improve, one must understand how things actually happen, what constraints exist, how they limit and bottleneck performance, and how those boundaries can be addressed or exploited. So that's the whole idea of this post, right? Systems is boss. It's again kind of that axiomatic belief. Systems are going to limit and bind our performance. We need to, if we want to do things better, if we want to be leaders in an industry or in organizations, what we need to do is proactively find where those limits are within our systems and try to loosen those bonds and try to break them so that we can achieve higher levels of performance. Um, so that thus ends the second post on Systems is Boss. And now we jump into the third post in this series, which I think, honestly, of this series is my favorite. It's called Are High Performers Real? And this is actually an important paradox, right? So we have this question of, okay, we believe that systems are going to bind our performance. Then how do we make sense of high performers, which we find all the time? So that's actually how this post starts, talking about this apparent paradox. It says all this talk about systems is great until you start to throw in superstars of performance. Michael Phelps won 23 gold medals. Simone Biles performs gymnastics routines that no other gymnast in the world dares to perform. Outside of sports, the same phenomenon can be observed. There exist in every industry and profession high performers. They shine, they exceed expectations, they outperform their peers by significant margins. Their achievements are real and measurable. The critical question is not whether their performance is superior, but why their performance is superior. So again, we have this paradox now. Going back to post one, okay, I'm telling you it's not about the individual, it's not about the individual. In post two, I'm saying we've got to identify where these constraints are in our systems. But now in post three, we're left with this paradox of, but we do see individual performers outperforming people who are, it seems like there are constraints on some performers that don't apply to others, like a Michael Phelps or a Simone Biles. So how do we make sense of that, right? And that's what this post is all about. So let's just sit with that paradox, sit with that that tension just for a moment. And what we find in this post anyway is that there are actually two different kinds of high performers. And confusing them leads to misguided management strategies that can actually harm performance. It is the same conundrum of deciphering between common and special causes of performance. So if you've ever, heard of Six Sigma or statistical process control, or have any kind of inkling into root cause analysis or anything like that, you may have heard of these things called common and special causes of variation or of performance. And it's essentially saying, and this is what we're going to get into, is that there are different reasons, there are different causes of variation. Some of them are just dictated by the system itself. You're not always going to have the same level of performance. That's actually what the next post is all about. But other times, there are special attributable causes where things are going radically different than what you would expect within the system. And those are, from a human performance perspective, what we ought to investigate and learn from and decipher what is causing these things to exceed our expectations of what the performance of a individual is capable of. So there's actually this great example of the Fosbury flop, which I'll show you. I posted something else in Medium, which again, you can find me in Medium. I post similar articles there. And it is the men's Olympic high jump winning heights from 1932 to 2020. And if you see this here, right, is in the 1940s, 1930s, they're starting at like 2 meters, which is, okay, that's pretty good, right? I can't jump 2 meters high. And then you have this absolutely huge increase where the total height jumped is increasing by like 50% in about 20 years, just absolutely astronomical. And then what happens is it quickly curbs off, and you can kind of see this variation. It starts, you kind of have small variation, and then by 2000, there's very, very small variation, right? You can see there's wide differences here, and now it's much smaller, and we've kind of hit that asymptote. We've kind of hit that limit. So what happened? Well, that is the subject of um, special cause variation. Um, let me read a little bit more to you. The tendency to attribute superior performance to individual characteristics rather than systematic advantages. It was one of the most persistent and damaging biases in our current understanding of how the world works. It leads to strategies that are not only ineffective, but actually counterproductive. When leaders and organizations focus on the individuals rather than the systems, they invest heavily in trying to select more people like their high performers. Businesses develop elaborate personality profiles, conduct extensive interviews, and pay premium salaries to attract top talent. But this is simply unsustainable, especially if these high performers are merely operating within the confines of the system. They strive harder with marginal results. So we have this chart here, the Fosbury flop. The reason I'm calling it the Fosbury flop here is because there's this guy, what was his name? Jim Fosbury, I think it was, Dick Fosbury. And in the 1960s, I think 1968, he developed a new way of jumping over the high jump bar. And this was, if you've ever seen somebody jump the high jump in the last, I don't know, 70 years, they're doing it this way, right? Their back goes over first, it drops their center of gravity, and then they can kick their legs over. Dick Fosbury invented that. Anybody before it was kind of jumping over the bar the first way. So what this chart shows is not all of these athletes suddenly getting better and suddenly having a higher level of athletic achievement, but it shows that somebody has identified where the bounds were within a system, and they broke loose those bounds by changing the technique, by changing how they approached the challenge of jumping over the high bar. And by changing their technique, by changing the method, and then perfecting that method, and over the course of about a generation, they achieved much, much higher levels of athletic achievement. And then what we see later on is a new steady state of the system has developed. That's this asymptote, right? That's this limit. And as people have perfected and continued to perfect that high jump, that variation has decreased ever so slightly. And now we have a very steady system. So that's the first kind of high performer, is somebody who can break away from the current system, usually through new acumen, new knowledge, new techniques, new approaches. And what that does is it changes the equation of what's limiting performance in the first place. We see that with Dick Fosbury. And then what we have kind of as our second level of performance, of high performers, is kind of the people who are lucky stars, right? It's the people who are operating within a particular system and they're performing well, but they're not breaking from the mold of the system. They happen to be lucky. Maybe they're pretty good salesmen. They're not orders of magnitudes higher than their next salesman. And what this means for leaders and organizations and management is that you need to understand and recognize the difference. Because if you find somebody who is marginally better than other people, that's great. We're happy about it, but we don't need to change our entire dynamics, our entire strategy, and our entire system because this one person happens to be successful. They're just operating as part of the broader, larger system, and they're operating well within that system. But when we find somebody like Dick Fosbury who is elevating the capability, the potential of the system, and is introducing new knowledge and new techniques, that is when we need to be aware of new constraints and new ways to change the system not just for Dick Fosbury, for him to perform better, but as we saw, for all of those different athletes to perform better, right? Is Dick Fosbury might have been the only one doing it, in the 1960s, but surely every athlete who learns to high jump, particularly at the Olympic level, is learning it with that new technique, and as a result, they're jumping higher and higher than ever before. So that is kind of the paradox of the high performers, right? Is it's a different. There are two types of high performers. One are high performers that are still bounded within the system, in which case you really shouldn't pay attention to them. Or the other one is that you have high performers like Michael Phelps, like Simone Biles, like Dick Fosbury, that are elevating what is possible. And those are the people you need to look for, because they're going to provide insights on how to improve the system going forward. Okay, and then the last article that we talk about in this one is actually, we already introduced it just a little bit. It's about variation. It's about how systems kind of are stable or not stable. So when we look at results in a system, we should expect to see results that happen kind of inconsistently, right? It's not always going to be the same result every single time, but we're going to have this kind of natural variation. So a couple excerpts from this. No system on Earth produces the same thing every time. Performance is never guaranteed and is always changing. For this reason, we say that the outputs, that is performance of all systems and processes, vary. Every outcome is a subject to fluctuation. So there's a great metaphor to this, a great example. A guy who studied a lot about systems and variation, his name was W. Edwards Deming. He uses this example of a boy noticing school bus arrivals, right? So maybe one day a school bus arrives at 7:02, another day the school bus arrives at 7:05, another day it arrives at 6:58, right? So there's this natural fluctuation of the school bus arrival time, 7 o'clock plus or minus 5 minutes, one way or the other. And that's a natural fluctuation. It's a natural variation of the school bus schedule. Now, and we would call that, we just talked about it a little bit in the last post about common cause variation. It's something that you don't have to go and find a cause for, right? It's just how the system fluctuates. I don't have to go and say this was the reason it arrived at 6:58 one day, and this is the reason that it arrived at 7:02 the next day. It's just the fluctuations of lights and traffics and different drivers. It's just part of the system, you would say, the system of school bus pickup. But if one day the school bus arrived at 7:30, well, wow, that's a big fluctuation. That's a big difference from what I was expecting, which is 7 o'clock plus or minus 5 minutes. So that would signal to us that this is beyond the normal fluctuations of the system, and we need to go and search for a attribute, an assignable cause, which I can say that was the reason why the school bus was 30 minutes late. And there's some usual suspects. Maybe it was a traffic accident. Maybe a stoplight was out. Maybe it snowed the night before and the roads were bad. Whatever it is, when there's a huge fluctuation like that, that is typically when we go and look for a root cause to the problem. Now, ironically, much of what politicians, leaders, managers, agents of change traditionally do actually introduces instability into otherwise stable systems. The path to hell is paved with good intentions, so the saying goes. The same is true of changing things in our world for the better. When individuals, however rational, react to normal fluctuations as though they are meaningful, when managers punish workers for a drop in performance, that is merely random variation, when politicians try to write new legislation to stimulate the economy, when doctors decry health academics and a population, they are actually tampering with the system in ways that make performance worse, not better. So I'll give you an example. I was working in an organization, and they were doing. They have this variable sales incentive, right? Where if you sell enough insurance, you'll get an extra so many dollars for every policy you sell. But on top of this, they had like 140 different sales incentives throughout the year, to inspire people to sell more of different products. Like 140 different sales incentives on top of the variable compensation. It's creating a huge amount of disruption, a huge amount of instability. And it really makes it impossible to actually evaluate whether or not the variable compensation structure is actually working, if it's actually producing the results that you want. Because there's so much disruption, there's so much tampering in this, that is actually causing lots of issues, and it's making it harder to diagnose and evaluate, and it's probably making performance worse anyway. So this actually is another issue because it can create ghosts of root causes, right? If we don't understand systems thinking, if we don't understand that some, variation is expected and we don't have to go finding the root cause, well, then we're going to try to find the root cause all the time. Every time fluctuation, oh, I was 2 minutes late to at that school bus stop. Now I have to go and do this. Oh, it was because this stoplight was too long or there was too much traffic there. And adding that, or going on those witch hunts, is going to add all kinds of uncertainty and unpredictability in your organizations and in your decision making, because you're not appreciating that there is a normal fluctuation to performance. And you should only be looking for root causes. You should only be looking for things, to address when things are wildly out of proportion to where they have been in the past. So that's what we call tampering. The article talks a lot about that. There's another cool little experiment that is also on my website that I would invite you to go and check out. It talks about it, of how tampering with systems actually create a negative performance within systems. But that's how I'm going to close out um, this stream today. So 4 articles all about individuals, systems, and performance. I hope you enjoyed them. Please go and read them. I spent a lot of time and I'm very passionate about it. So if you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and ring the bell so you get notified when we go live. That's kind of the typical YouTube thing. If you want to get these broadcasts as podcasts, make sure to subscribe and follow me on Substack. I am at Substack. If you search Systems of Human Performance, or I'll try to put these on, different streaming services as well. So if you search Systems of Human Performance podcast on your favorite platform, you should find it there. Thanks, everyone. And as always, I can't wait to see you next time.